What's going on, guys? Joe McCall here, the Real Estate Investing Mastery Podcast. This is going to be a really good episode, and I'm excited about this. Something that I've never talked about before. This is a sensitive topic to some people. Some people probably don't even care. And some people it matters a lot, and some people it doesn't. And I'm trying to figure it out for myself. Well, I had a friend connect me with another friend who is a pastor here in St. Louis. His name is Brent Roam. And he has a ministry doing some pretty cool, exciting things in the city. And so this friend of ours, mutual friend, said, hey, you guys should talk about this issue on your podcast. And the topic is housing discrimination, right? And I think everybody could agree that, yeah, housing discrimination existed at one time, but does it still exist today? And if it does, what can I do about it, right? Is there anything I can do about it? Or should I even care? Or, that was 50 years ago. What does it matter today? And I had a great conversation with our guest today, a couple days ago, and it really opened my eyes to a lot of things. And I was open and honest with him. And I said, man, this would be really good to talk about on the podcast. And he was gracious enough to agree. And so we're going to bring him on here. And I just wanted to do a couple housekeeping things first. House cleaning. This might turn into a house cleaning. We'll see. Anyway, housekeeping things first. We're going to be broadcasting this live in the Facebooks and YouTubes right now. So if you are watching this on Facebook and YouTube, please say hi, say hello, tell us where you're from, and type them in the comments. Give us a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel. I'd love to see your comments. And then if you have questions or if you have comments, keep them clean. And if they're good comments, I will show them on the screen here. And if you probably have some good questions, and I would love to ask your questions to our guest, Brent, today as we go through this. All right. So let me think if there was anything else. Oh yeah. If you are listening to this in podcasts, whatever your podcasting app is, I appreciate you very much. And I just ask that you would subscribe to the podcast, no matter, even if you listen to the podcast on my favorite podcast app is Pocket Casts. But I'd still appreciate the subscribe over at Apple Podcasts because that's still the biggest podcast player. So subscribe and leave us a review. Let us know what you think. All right. So that's all the housekeeping I got. Let's see if we can bring over Brent Roam. Brent, are you there?
Yeah, man.
How are you?
Good. How are you, Joe?
Good to meet you finally face to face. We've talked on the phone a little bit.
Thanks for having me.
You are you're in St. Louis, and where do you live? In the University City area, right?
Yeah, I live in U City. Yep.
Describe what U City, kind of what is it like there? Because I'm in the suburbs.
Yeah.
And kind of the nicer suburbs, I would say. But you're closer to the city. What's it like there where you live?
Yeah, I love U City. U City is kind of right on the edge of the city-county divide. And so there's kind of an urban feel, I'm actually my office looks out on the Delmar Loop. So I'm looking out, there's some kind of marijuana shop right there. There's a frozen yogurt shop right there. There's sushi over there. But anyway, it's that kind of a vibe.
And some really good coffee shops too, right?
Yeah. Meshuggah's right down the street, Blueprint, and all those. So it's got a lot of flavor. It's a very eclectic feel. There's just all different kinds of people, different nationalities, different walks of life. And I love it, man. It's kind of on this, they call it the city-county divide in St. Louis, and that's a big deal in St. Louis for your St. Louis listeners will know. But it's also on the corner of what they call the Delmar divide. And the Delmar divide has some racial connotations because basically south of Delmar is predominantly white, and then north of Delmar is predominantly black. And so there's just it's just a crossroads of a lot of different people. And it's one of the things I love about it.
We're going to talk about that. Where I live, just to give context to some folks, about all the variety we have for coffee is a Starbucks and McDonald's coffee, right? And then we've got, a Home Depot and Walmart and Lowe's and Target. Bunch of box stores, national chain restaurants, Buffalo Wild Wings, Olive Gardens. And about the only time I go, and that's beautiful there. I used to go out into the city all the time when I was working on my MBA at SLU, St. Louis University. But like the only time we go out there is to go to a Cardinals game or something like that, right?
Right.
And I'm just sharing this to the audience so you kind of get the context of where we're from. And Brent, I want to ask you about your background a little bit.
Yeah.
And then I'll share people a little bit more about my background. But go ahead.
Okay.
Where are you from, and talk about how you got into what you're doing now?
So I am from St. Louis. My dad grew up in an area called Wellston, which is just north of U City. My grandfather's from St. Louis. I'm like multi-generational here. My grandfather was a Pentecostal preacher, and so was my dad. And then, so I decided for sure never to go into the ministry was my goal in life. So at like 18, 19, I took a long circuitous trip. I ended up studying overseas for a while, then ended up in Los Angeles for years. And then I started practicing law. And then I ended up moving back to St. Louis, back to University City, probably about a mile from where my dad grew up.
Wow.
And long story short is I felt, I had for over a decade, I had tried to avoid becoming a pastor. And, I just couldn't do it anymore. Like I finally had to give into it in a good way. I had a deep sense of calling towards it.
Yeah.
So anyway, finally did it, left my law practice. And then we actually launched our church in the Tivoli Theater, which is kind of right in the middle of the Delmar Loop.
It's a historic landmark. It's
big time. And what's funny is my dad, when he grew up, he was a kid he grew up like about a mile from here, and they weren't allowed to go to movies in those days because they were old school, like super strict, Yeah. And so he would ride his bike down to the Tivoli and sneak into the Tivoli as a kid, And so now here it is, all these years later.
Is he still alive?
He's not. But I wish he could. I wish he could see us today, man. I mean, his mind would be blown at this place where he snuck into as a teenager.
No way. Church. I'm sure he can see it. He knows.
Yeah, that's right.
He knows.
That's right.
All right. So what, if you don't mind me asking, like, where is your family from? Like, do you have any minority in you?
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Yeah. So we're like apparently, you do your DNA test. We're like 90 something percent like Irish, Scottish.
Wow. Okay.
But I'm on my mother's side, we're also Cherokee. We're members of the Cherokee Nation.
Okay. Wow.
And we didn't discover this, and I actually never even said this publicly, but we did a series on race at our church recently. And then my sister was doing some research after that series and discovered that in the 1870 census, my great-great-great-grandma and her mother were deemed mulatto in the census, which means in 1870 that basically meant some degree of African extraction plus whatever else.
Okay.
So nobody in our family has ever talked about that. Nobody has ever mentioned that. Like I didn't know that. We talked to my mom and my uncle, and they're like, we never heard that. But it's really fascinating because we went onto the census data, and it actually looks like they were originally marked black and then scratched out and then mulatto.
Wow.
So I'm interested to learn more about that story because that's just something that I learned like maybe 3 or 4 months ago. But that's kind of the ethnic mix of our family.
Now, I'm going to guess you're in your 20s.
Oh, I love you, dude. I love you, man.
So I got to play it safe.
Yeah.
I'm just playing it safe.
Oh, no, man. I'm in my 40s, bro.
Okay. All right.
You see, I got even a little bit of sprig of white hair coming in here.
So you grew up in St. Louis. What I was trying to go with that was you grew up in St. Louis in the
80s.
80s. Right.
Yeah.
So what was it like in the 80s from a racial standpoint where you lived, where you were living back then? Was it pretty diverse, or what was it like back then?
We moved to Bridgeton which is kind of North County.
Yeah.
And it was Bridgeton in the 80s was mostly white. the busing, the DSEG program was happening. So the busing program was going on in those days. So I went to Pattonville, and it was actually a pretty diverse school. Some African American folks that went there, like lived in the neighborhood. But there was also the DSEG program, so a lot of black students were bused in from the city, and so it was actually a pretty diverse place even growing up. When I was a real young kid, we moved to Ohio, a little town, Lancaster, Ohio, a little glass manufacturing blue collar town because my dad was a pastor there. That was like an almost all white town. So when we moved back to St. Louis, it had a much more diverse feel than what I had been accustomed to when I was little in Ohio.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so when you came here to pastor a church, why the U City? Why not the wealthier, more faster growing areas where most new churches are planted?
Man, it's kind of a mix of two things. One is I felt like on a purely emotional level, I don't like want to overly spiritualize this, but like I really felt like God was calling me to this area. Like this was where I was being drawn to in a very deep way, like in a way that like 5 or 7 years before I moved. No, I think it was about 5 years before I even moved. I can't remember how long it was, but years before I moved, I said, I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to end up back in University City. I'm going to be planting a church. This is when I was in law school, or even before law school. And anyway, so there was this kind of real, just deep, I don't know what you would call that, spiritual / emotional draw there. There was another piece though, too, where I felt like there, at least for me, was a redemptive piece where this was an area where, like Wellston U City, was an area where, in the 60s, there was a big shift. When the Fair Housing Act came out, basically a lot of white families, and on my dad's side, they were all kind of like Irish, German kind of extract. But a lot of white families basically moved out to the county, like en masse. And it really kind of, in a way, crushed some of the local municipalities here, because like an entire tax base left. And from a real estate standpoint, like people just left, and like the property values just fell apart. And
why do you think they left?
I think for me, my sense of it is, to a large extent, it had to do with race. It had to do with like, I think probably some fear and anxiety about, talking 1960s. So I think there was probably some significant fear about, like, for white folks, about like, what is it like to be like going to school with black folks? And, up until that point, you had separate drinking fountains, separate neighborhoods, separate everything, and now it's like, okay, wait, we're all supposed to mix together. And I do think there was I think there were a lot of people that were afraid of that. And like, now one of the things that I think helped U City, this area where we are now, is that a lot of white folks didn't leave U City, and they just said, we're going to stay. And so black people moved into the neighborhood. One of my neighbors in my neighborhood was the first black guy on the block. And he's a local historian. His name's Dr. Wright. He's friggin' awesome if you ever look him up. But he was the first black guy to buy a piece of property in our neighborhood. And, and then another black family moved in, who was a police detective, Mr. Anderson. And then a couple other folks moved in, and it kind of just stayed. It kind of just stayed like that. That neighborhood stayed intact, but the neighborhoods where everybody left, tax base left, full schools fell apart, infrastructure fell apart. Like Wellston, man, it just fell apart completely where my dad grew up.
So a lot of people listening to this, I'm sorry, I was just going to say, a lot of people listening to this have heard of Ferguson.
Yeah.
And you're talking about an area not too far from Ferguson. How long does it take to get to Ferguson?
We're just a few miles south of Ferguson. We're like,
say it again.
I said, we're just a few miles south of Ferguson. Yeah. We're about 4 or 5 miles south of Ferguson.
Yeah. And Ferguson's not a bad area. It's actually nice.
Yeah, man.
It's not, people outside of St. Louis think that it's in the hood or it's in the really bad area.
Beautiful.
It's a great little nice area. I wanted to ask about this. Why did people leave back then? Because some people are going to think, well, weren't they leaving mainly because, there was newer housing out there, bigger property, bigger backyards. That was the trend of the suburbanites, suburban areas where you get newer homes, newer schools, bigger backyards, more space between you and the neighbors. Could that also have been a reason too?
Oh yeah, man. Okay. I mean, I think absolutely. I don't know that those two things are separate, because at the same time, you've got this new supply, and then you have an increased demand. If you're seeing large exoduses in mass. And it's all one one ethnic group.
Yeah. So you're in an area of U City. It's more progressive, I would say. Right? Is that fair? Not a bad, like we want to keep politics out of this.
Yeah.
But progressive in not a liberal versus conservative way.
It's pretty liberal, actually.
It is. Okay. Yeah, it is.
But
all right. I wanted to ask you, or I wanted you to retell the story, what you were telling me. You wanted to do some remodeling on your house. You're in U City, which is a good area.
Yeah.
You wanted to do some remodeling, and you looked into the house in the covenants or something like that.
Yeah. Okay. So I read a book, I think it was like 4 or 5 years ago, called The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein. This book is like this friggin' thick, and it's like just very like detailed history of the way that real estate and race interacted from like the 20s till the present. I mean, it's a very detailed historical book, right? And the way the guy writes is very like kind of granular. I mean, he gets into the weeds, and so I'm reading about St. Louis in the book, because St. Louis comes up, and it's talking about all of these kind of racially restrictive covenants that were imposed on St. Louis. These red line districts where, like, they call it that because they would literally take a red marker and line it out and say no loans in this section, like in black sections, where black folks live. And just all of these different, he was documenting all of these different, racially restrictive kind of covenants, restrictions, ordinances, codes, all this kind of stuff. So I live in U City, so I'm thinking, I wonder, because one of the premises of the book is like a lot of neighborhoods have these racially restrictive covenants. So I'm like, I wonder if my house, my neighborhood does. So I emailed the librarian, like right down the block. I'm like, hey, do you guys have any kind of the legal indentures for my neighborhood? They were my address. And so she said, yeah, all the restrictive covenants and all that are the indentures are over here. Send me a link. So I pulled mine up. I found it online, right? So
these are deed restrictions, and they're still in place and valid today, right?
Oh yeah, this is still in place in my neighborhood. So this is the indenture that governs my neighborhood. And so it was drafted in 1922. So
let's explain too. This says, you can't have a fence above this certain height.
Yeah.
You can't
have the gutters. Don't paint your doors purple. Don't put a fence in the front yard. You can't have antennas. I don't know. All that kind of stuff. Like all the stuff that you probably weren't going to do anyway. But can't park your car on blocks, and you know what I mean. Like so that kind of stuff. So it's got all of this kind of super boring stuff, and I'm reading through it, and then I see on like in the middle of it, like it says there was a part where it says, I don't know if you can see that. You might not be able to see that, but it says words removed. Okay, words removed. So I go down to the words removed, and I find that there was a phrase. The words that were removed basically say that these houses in this neighborhood may not be used by, and then the words that were removed were Negroes or Malays. And so I had never even heard of the word Malays, but I looked it up, and basically it was a term in the 1920s that meant like brown people, like Asian, anybody brownish. So basically the covenant, my covenant on my house in my neighborhood says no black people or brown people can live here. Wow. Right? Now that part of my indenture was deleted. The words were removed, and I'm like, when were they removed? I'll just show you this real quick because it's just so freaking crazy. The words were in blue were removed in 1993.
1993.
I'm like, wait, the restrictive covenant that says no black or brown people can live in this neighborhood, that wasn't taken out of this covenant until 1993. Wow. So now it wasn't enforceable from a legal standpoint after 1964.
Because of the what happened in 64?
Fair Housing Act, I think, came out in 64. And it said, hey, none of that stuff is enforceable anymore. Like, you can't tell black people they can't live in your neighborhood. Okay. So that was like a federal, act that came out in 64. So technically that would not have been enforceable if somebody took it to court. But they didn't, it wasn't stricken from my house until 1993. And like, this is like where I live. My children live here and my family lives here. And I'm like, man, so that really, I think that piece of it for me, Joe, I just started really thinking deeply, and it struck me also from a spiritual standpoint, like a justice standpoint. Like, I just started going, man, that just, I hadn't seen it that close.
Yeah.
You think, you kind of hear about it in the past in the abstract, and you go, wait a minute, my house was restricted. No black people, brown people could live in my house. And that code was there until 1993. And so that's what kind of got me, researching this stuff a little bit more and diving a little bit deeper in. Yeah.
Well, one of the things we were talking about, and these are things I've wrestled with, right? Because we all understand and agree that housing discrimination is wrong. But somebody might say, listen, like, we passed that law in the 60s. Okay, we're past that. Yeah. Why does it still matter today? And like, what, so what if it was in the restrictions, and people were idiots back in the 20s, right? Like, so how does it still affect people today?
Okay. I think that's a great question, because I think most of us think about ourselves in the present tense.
Sure.
We kind of see ourselves in a snapshot, like we're right here, right? But when I think about 1964, what I think about is, okay, that's my parents, and that's your parents.
Yeah.
In fact, that's almost everybody that I know's parents were born before 1964, and lived through that period. That means every black person that I know, every black person that goes to our church, either they or their mom and dad were not allowed to live in my neighborhood. Which means they could not accrue equity in a home, generational wealth, access to, nice schools out in, West County. Now we all know, man, like there have been people of color and, who have like grinded it out and figured it out, gotten out,
Nelly owns, is it Nelly or 50? Owns a house in Wildwood. It's been in the news lately too.
Oh, has it?
Yeah, it's like a big $2 million house, and now it's only worth like $500,000. But
but
anyway,
I'd still take it.
Bad example.
Yeah. But we know, like they're. But when you think about it, like in a large group, and you think about every black person know's mom and dad were prohibited from the benefit of owning a home in a nice neighborhood, which means they were prohibited from building generational wealth and the kind of equity that you can build in a home, and like having access to a good school district and all of that stuff. Like every black person his or her mom and dad were subjected to this. And so even though 1964, we go, yeah, okay, we're done with that. Part of it, for me, as I look at it, is, you got from 1619 to 1964, you've got either slavery or Jim Crow laws or racially restricted covenant. You got something blocking the way, blocking the path, stealing. And so then the rules changed in 1964. Thank God. Okay, we're going to go fair and square here, right? But the consequences, like the long-term consequences for an entire population for that kind of, oppressive, covenants and restrictions, the long-term consequences of that, I think, are the thing that we see now.
It didn't just go away then, is what you're saying. It just didn't disappear.
It's kind of like, yeah, like the analogy is like a football game, or like what's your sport, Joe? What do you like? Are you football? Baseball. Okay, so two baseball teams, right? And one's let's call it an orange team, and one's a green team, right? And every time the green team comes up the bat, the ump calls strikes when it's balls. Anytime they hit a hit or a home run or whatever, it's called back. They don't allow them to score. And then the orange team is allowed, they score every time they score. They're allowed to score. They get on base, whatever. It's the seventh inning. Now orange team winning 28-0, right? Umps come out at seventh inning and go, you know what, guys, we screwed this up. We shouldn't do this. We're going to play by the rules. Everybody fair and square, right? We're going to play by the rules now. Well, it's seventh inning. It's 28-0 or whatever, right? Half the green team is like, screw this. They checked out in the fourth inning because it's like, this sucks. The ones that are left are tired, and so you got a few more innings to try to, score. But the thing has been weighted against you for so long as a team, as a group, that, without some intervention, you're gonna get some scores. You're gonna get on base, right? But you're not gonna catch up. You're not gonna get 28 runs, and you're not gonna slow down the other team anyway. I mean, and so I kind of see it in that light, like this, the impact, the consequences, and the effects of these laws on our current situation is like that. Like we stopped the steal, right? We stopped the injustice in the sense that we passed laws as a country that said you can't do this anymore. But the consequences of what we've been doing are just still like, all you got to do is just look in any black neighborhood, and in any city, in any predominantly black neighborhood, and higher crime rates, higher incarceration, drug use, despair, depression, whatever, name it, crime. The impact, the effects of these kinds of policies that got stopped, in your mom and dad's and my mom and dad's age, the long-term consequences of those is, we're still feeling that, we're still seeing that, even though we technically stopped the.
Yeah, and it's crazy to think it wasn't that long ago.
It wasn't. That's a weird thing, man.
And even if they could buy, a neighborhood would let them in. Was it really that hard to get a mortgage? Or was it?
No. So mortgage lenders were also permitted to not issue mortgages to black people. In fact, in many cases, their company's policy was to refuse anybody. So there would sometimes be like a white person who would get the mortgage for the black person, and they would try to work it out that way. But then if they had a racially restrictive covenant in the neighborhood, then the neighborhood would sue, and then the black person would be kicked out anyway. When black people were allowed to buy, this is really interesting. When black people were allowed to buy in neighborhoods, what some of the studies have shown is that the property values would go up because a black person would be willing to pay more to get into than a white person, because it was so limited. They had so few options that if they did find a neighborhood that would allow them in, they're going to pay top dollar to get in, and which would bring up the property values of the other houses around them. But yeah.
Wow. Okay, so you started a ministry to. It's not even. Would you call it a ministry?
I mean, it's technically a secular nonprofit. You know,
Yeah.
I'm a preacher pastor, so I can't, like, everything for me is steeped in the
Sure.
spiritual side of it. But it's you know, yeah, it's really I would call it like a justice organization. You know, I could, you know, you call it ministry.
I want to talk about it real quick, and then I want to talk about some other things. But it's the website. I want you all to go to it. It's called thefamstl.com. Thefamstl.com. I'm going to add it in here to the banner and make sure I spelled it right.
Yep. THEFAMSTL.
STL. Is that it right there?
Yeah, that's it. Perfect.
Yeah. The Fam STL, and the website says your goal is to eliminate race as a factor in home ownership throughout St. Louis in one generation.
Yeah.
All right. So eliminating race as a factor in home ownership
Yeah.
in one generation. Would you say it's still a factor today?
Yeah, it's a factor. Like, it's a factor if you look at, you know, all you have to do is look at, like, the percentage of white folks that own homes and the percentage of black folks that have homes, and you go, you know, there's a massive disparity, right? And you're left with the question, why is that disparity? You know, and then you got to ask some really tough questions, right? Is it because somehow black people are inherently worse at buying homes, or don't work as hard, or don't, you know, care as much? Is there something inherently or implicit about being black, you know, or is there something? Was there something that has been imposed on us, or, you know, that has caused it to be this way? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So it's still a factor in the sense that, like, you know, like in every respect, like, you know, blacks have lower as a you know, statistically, just lower income, higher crime rates, you know, higher incarceration, all of that, right? So race plays a factor in all of that.
I want to share my screen here, and those of you listening to the audio, I will kind of read this out loud as well here. It's this one, isn't it? All right, you see my screen there, guys? All right, this is the thefamstl.com. Oh, wait, here we go. Let me get to this site. All right, I'm going to zoom in a little bit, and this is the home page, and this is the data. I want to talk about the data here. Can you see my screen okay? Looks good there, I think.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, I'm pulling it up on mine too.
All right.
I can see it.
Children born into African-American households will experience, on average, higher rates of poverty, higher likelihood to be victims of crime, fewer educational opportunities, lower incomes, greater rates of incarceration, higher rates of drug alcohol addiction, lower high school and college graduation rates, and a shorter life expectancy than their white counterparts. This is crazy to me. The median wealth of white households in the United States is $171,000 a year, which is 10 times the median wealth of black households, which is $17,000. 1 in 4 black households have zero or negative net worth, compared to less than 1 in 10 white families. And you compared here 2 zip codes. And when I first saw this, I thought, is that fair? But explain, I think it is. And explain this a little bit. These are 2 zip codes that are right next to each other, right? 63105 and 63106.
Yep.
And the difference in the racial makeup, it's about 78% white in the more expensive zip code, and it's 2% white in the city zip code.
Yeah.
4% unemployment in Clayton, and 24% unemployment in Jeff Vanderloo. All right. 7% live below the poverty line in Clayton. 54% live under the poverty line in the other zip code. $90,000 median household income over there. $15,000 median household income over there. Life expectancy, 85 over here, 67 over there.
Yeah.
And then this goes into more of the causes of the problem. I want people to go here and look at this. This is, it'll disturb you, in a good way, and it'll make some of you very uncomfortable. Like, and I'll be honest, it made me uncomfortable. Like, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Like, okay, well, what can I do about it? Right? Like, am I supposed to feel guilty? And the whole thing of white guilt. We're going to talk about that. And so Brent had some really good things that he shared with me later. But look at this, guys. 98% of home loans in the white families from 1934 to 1962. 98% of all home loans went to white families from 1934 to 1962. So this goes on, and I like this too. In other words, the upward and downward wealth trends set in motion by decades of state-sponsored discrimination policies will not reverse themselves. They will continue to move in their respective directions until they are systematically halted and reversed with the same degree of intentionality with which they were originally set in motion. So I want to talk to you about the solution, Brent, and I mean, what can we do about this? It seems overwhelming. If you first can recognize that it is a problem, it's like, oh my gosh, now what? What do we do about it?
Yeah.
What do you say to that?
So my gut on it is this. Every factor that you can think of that demonstrates either a good life outcome or a bad life outcome, almost every one of those factors is tied to where you live in the United States. As that little illustration shows, like where I live is going to impact the level of education that I can get, the level of the kind of groceries I can buy, how safe my neighborhood is, like literally everything, right? The amount of drug addiction in my neighborhood, the amount of crime in my neighborhood, the amount of gangs in my neighborhood. So where I live impacts everything. So the intuition that me and the other folks that kind of got this thing going is that if that is the one factor, your home, where you live, that impacts so many other factors. And for most Americans, this is your main, I guess you would call it an asset. Like your home is not only a place where you live and sleep, but it's like the best investment that you're gonna ever get to make for your average family, right? Yeah. So like if the problem started as a result of this, with the housing, because I think and I'm not like a researcher, so like, but the people who have looked at this have said like even like where you live, it basically created ghettos, because the more you put poor people together and then prevent them from rising up, then you are going to have increased crime and drug use and despair, all that stuff, So anyway, so the intuition is, okay, if we could actually provide opportunities for people whose moms and dads were prevented from experiencing some of the things that you and I know to be like really valuable, home ownership and everything that goes with it, then perhaps the solution is baked into that very same dynamic. So what if we find a way to provide home ownership opportunities for African-American families and individuals in St. Louis, to give them an opportunity to live in a neighborhood that where their kids have a shot at a competitive school district, it's safe, there aren't guns and bullets flying around, we're not shooting for Ladue and Clayton right now. We're like, but what if our clientele was able to move into a place that was safe and good and healthy and that would give them a better shot. So that's why we ended up with this model of basically saying, this is what caused the problem. Maybe this is where the solution lies also, is to provide opportunities to the best of our ability to provide opportunities for people who are working, making money, but who are behind because the generation before them were way behind, and the generation before them were just shattered. But because I just know so many people, African American folks, who working hard, working 2 jobs, but they're digging out from generations of bad stuff happening. And so, they've got tons of student loans, working hard, but renting and not getting ahead. And so our thought was like, what if we put together an organization that could help people buy homes and start building wealth, start creating generational wealth, start building equity, start having some, being able to map out a path for their life. So that's how we ended up on this.
So what does that look like? What do you guys do for them?
So this is where it gets really interesting, because each family is so different. Some of the families that we're working with have great income, but they have really bad credit and debt. So we are working to design ways to increase their credit score and get rid of some of the predatory debt. We got folks in our clientele that have predatory loans that are in the 20s and 30s%. It's just like, what in the world, but a lot of our clients are like, they are first generation. That might be first generation high school, first generation college, and kind of emerging without a lot of help from the prior generation. So we're kind of customizing the solution for each client, and working with different lending institutions to kind of bring in some of the programs that they have, working with them, increasing debt or decreasing debt, increasing your credit score, doing some personal finance training, budgeting training, some education around those issues, providing other kinds of support. There's legal support needed, wraparound services, and basically customizing this for each family.
Yeah.
This has been our, we kicked this off recently. So this year is, we're working with each family individually, and we're finding out what we don't know in a lot of ways. We're like, oh, okay, yeah, didn't expect that. All right, let's address that. Fortunately, we've got tons of people in the community around us that are either finance people, real estate people, lawyers, all these different mental health counselors, like all these different people that are also willing to jump in and be a part, because it does take all of that to kind of move the ball forward.
One of the things I want to ask you is how can real estate investors actually help you with this? And but first, I want to talk about something here, like with any podcast, most of the audience is like the host, right? So most of my audience they're white like me. They're suburban dads and suburban moms.
Yeah.
I grew up pretty poor. I didn't know I was poor. My dad was a hard worker. He was a janitor. Yeah. I was in a trailer park. Grew up in a trailer park. My dad worked at McDonald's for a long time, and then became a janitor, and then kind of started his own business. I didn't know I was poor until, actually I started really thinking about it like 20 years ago when I was in my 20s.
Yeah.
And like, oh man, I guess I was poor back then. But like, I didn't have, none of my family went to college. Mm-hmm. And I'm speaking to what I know some other people, these are things that I've thought myself. Yep. And I know a lot of other people are thinking this, like, yeah, I understand there's discrimination, but like, hey, I didn't have it easy either. Right. Yeah. Like, we grew up poor. We didn't have much to go, I had to pay my way through college. I had to go get a job and work my way. And, so I graduated from college. So talk to the person. You brought up a really good analogy. Yeah. And the other thing I want to bring up here is the whole the white guilt thing, right? Because like sometimes guys like me,
the what thing? Sorry, I lost
the white
I
guilt.
lost you just for a second.
I'm sorry, the white guilt.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
some people now get on the defensive all of a sudden and think, wait, you want me to just apologize? I didn't have anything to do with that back then. And
Right.
and now, if you listen to NPR or something like that,
Yeah.
you get these white people that are doing telling it that all the other white people, you need to feel bad, and you need to so then there's like, well, wait a minute, like it's a big mess right now, especially politically and what's going on with the politics, and there's a huge divide, and it's sad, and I'm hoping that this podcast maybe does a little bit of introspection to white folks like me. And so you brought up a really good analogy of the Good Samaritan, right?
Yeah.
What was that? Talk about that.
So I think shame and guilt and condemnation, all that stuff, honestly, man, I don't think it's helpful. I don't think it's useful. It doesn't get you anywhere. It's not, I think it can be I honestly think it can be counterproductive, because if you've done enough mea culpas, right, then you're absolved, right? Like, okay, well, all right, I already said I'm sorry. So, so I'm not, I honestly, man, like that stuff, I just can't, I don't think that's helpful. The story of the Good Samaritan is what strikes me from a faith standpoint, because Good Samaritan, your listeners probably know this story, but a man is a Jewish guy is been beaten and left for dead at the side of the road. And then, a priest comes by, sees the guy, goes to the other side of the road, keeps on going. A Levite, another kind of religious pastor, basically, comes by, sees the guy, goes to the other side of the road, keeps on going. A Samaritan, somebody who doesn't share this guy's faith, doesn't share his ethnicity, doesn't share his language, whatever. Totally.
A minority.
A minority, yeah, exactly, right? Comes over and not only helps the guy, heals the guy, puts the oil on him, puts him on his donkey, takes him to an inn, and pays the innkeeper and says, hey, take care of this guy. And if I owe you anything else because he has to stay longer, I'll come back, I'll pay you for the rest of it. Never does he say, not my fault. He doesn't.
He never said it's not my responsibility.
Not my responsibility. He never says that. He says, I see a guy who's been injured. I see a guy who's been harmed. I see a guy who's been hurt. And I have compassion. I am moved with compassion because I see that an injustice was done. I don't feel guilty about the injustice. I didn't do the injustice. The Good Samaritan didn't beat the guy. But I'm going to do something about it because I can, and because it's the right thing to do. And so I think of it like this: responsibility, irrespective of culpability, right? So the Good Samaritan is not culpable. He didn't do anything to put the Jewish guy on the side of the road, beaten up and bleeding. Irrespective of no culpability, he says, I'm going to take responsibility because it's the right thing to do. Because I've seen an injustice and I want to address the injustice. And that analogy, that metaphor translates for me into this situation. Anybody of goodwill, I don't care what your political background or your ethnicity or whatever is, anybody with their eyes open says, hey man, there's been 350 years of brutal injustice against a group of people. And that injustice legally ended with your mom and dad and my mom and dad. The long-term consequences of that, like when the Good Samaritan came up, the guy was no longer being beaten, so the injustice had been stopped, right? But the healing hadn't happened, and so this is kind of like, all right, let's bring a salve to this. Let's see if we can make the guy whole again. And
I love that analogy too, because like nobody asked the Good Samaritan to feel any guilt, to take any responsibility in terms of like, oh, this is my fault. He just did what he could to fix it.
Yeah.
Because he had compassion. And I was reading that Bible verse yesterday morning after we talked.
Yeah.
And that verse just struck me because he had compassion. And that's so much like what God does for us.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, this compassion basically means I feel you. I feel your suffering, as you're describing your background, Joe, and I'm thinking like, I'm thinking of your dad, like working his butt off and like, grinding it out to give you guys a good life, And I'm thinking my story is very, very similar, man. My grandpa had an 8th grade education. Both of my grandpas, 8th grade education. My grandpa was a bus mechanic in St. Louis. And he actually worked for the 3 C's, which was a welfare organization that allowed guys that were dirt poor to go build bridges, and they would send the money back to their parents, and he fortunately he had opportunities. He could buy a house. He was permitted. He was legally permitted to do that. So he did that, and he started to get ahead, and he ended up being like a middle class guy, out in Bridgeton, like living in off of Mark Twain Lane, which is nice. And so we see that when somebody's given a shot, when people have an opportunity, when they can see a path, if you've got any guts and chutzpah, you're going to get out there, you're going to grind, you're going to work. And for me, it's like, I want to help provide a path for people who maybe they don't see the path yet, not because I feel guilty or ashamed or anything like that or condemned. It's because, hey man, there was a problem. There was an injustice. That's why when I talk about this organization, it's not a charity organization. It's a justice organization.
Yeah.
We're trying to address a wront that hasn't been addressed.
This is really good. And again, I want to encourage you guys to go to thefamstl.com. Brent, talk a little bit about, just real quick, about what can we do? Like,
I like the question about the real estate investor thing, because one of the models that we are looking at is, so some of the lending institutions are willing to they're willing to take a risk on some of our clients. And then our organization, the FAM, we're willing to subsidize that risk, right? So let's say that Bank A says we're going to give you a 90% loan or an 80% loan. And the FAM says, we'll give you a 20% loan. And now we can get this family situated, surround them with some support. Now they're homeowners, they're paying their mortgage, right? One of the things that we are willing to do, and we're beginning to explore this, is we'd be willing to sell our loan at a discount. We're an organization that is a nonprofit. We're not trying to make money. Nobody in our organization is paid $0. We have no overhead. Everything that we do is towards. I think we've spent like less than $2,000 like on a website, a couple things like that. But one of the models is, would there be investors out there that would be interested, because they're passionate about this or they care about this, in taking some of the loans, our loans, and we sell the loan and we take a loss, and it's and then that investor would actually own a second mortgage on that house or whatever, so those are some models that we're beginning to explore. You're smarter than me on all this, Joe, man. I mean, I if something like that worked, if you had listeners that said, I kind of dig what they're doing. Maybe I'm not in a position to give a big chunk of money to the organization right now, but I would feel pretty good about holding a mortgage on a house of a family that's trying to make it. And, and it's not going to, you're not going to get a massive return, but, you could get some interest, and you could be helping somebody out and being a part of something cool,
There's I just interviewed a friend of mine earlier today. His name is Adam Zach, and he has a company called Set Your Rent. Okay. And what he does is he helps people that a lot of small business owners who can't get a loan right now. If they have enough money to put down 10%, he will actually go buy a house for them. Wow. He's got the investors that will buy the house and then either lease option it back to the tenant, give them a couple, 3-4 years to buy it. And so if anybody listening to this, I'd encourage you to go back to listen to that. Adam Zach was his name on my podcast, and he has a website, Set Your Rent. He's only done like 25 of these deals, and he's in North Dakota, I think. But yeah, there's a lot of my audience is familiar with rent to own lease options. I just want to talk about this real quick.
Yeah.
Rent to own is a great strategy, but it's also been abused in the lower minority community, in the lower, cheaper neighborhoods, lower end, cheaper neighborhoods, right? Just, can you talk about the whole that all of that's going on, because it sometimes gets a bad rap, and justifiably so in a lot of ways, right? But like there is a good way and a right way to do those kinds of things, right?
Yeah, I'll talk just for a minute about one of the abusive ways that it was done before. They were called land contracts.
Yeah.
And they were so onerous that like you ended up in a much worse financial position if you got into one of these than you would otherwise. Because if there was any little T not crossed or I not dotted, then you would end up losing your house altogether. And a lot of Black families, actually, that was the only way that they could buy a home, because of the covenants and restrictions and all that. And so anyway, that made it even worse. I have seen situations too where the lease to own is a kind of, I don't know if it's a bait and switch, but it can be a kind of holding it out there. It's like this carrot out here, like you could own this, but the terms are so bad that at the end of the day, like it doesn't make sense, and they actually end up not owning it anyway. So
So there's what is the right way to do it though? The
lease to own or the rent to own? Man, I mean, that's another model that we're looking at for us, because it would require like no down payment for our client, and they would be able to pay rent, and then we would either take the loss, because again, our organization is okay taking a loss on each family. Like we're willing to spend money on each family. That's part of what we're doing. So I think one way we could do it would be like the rent that has been accrued over X percentage of time. We could end up rolling that into the into the total nut, and then and now they've already got equity immediately. There's
a lot of investors that are rehabbing houses. They're buying houses in good, solid areas.
Yeah,
and they're wanting to maybe rent it, maybe sell it. They don't know. Are you looking for investors that could maybe bring you deals, not necessarily give them away and donate them, but like bring you good, solid houses?
Yes,
that might be a good fit for one of these families.
That would be huge. One of the things that one of the guys that we're working with is a guy named Brandon Wilkes in St. Louis, and he's also a pastor, and he also has a passion for this, and he's also he also is great at construction. So one of the things that he's been doing with some of his folks is he and his wife will buy the house. They will rehab the house. They'll basically make the house worth, let's say the house is worth $100,000 after the rehab. They will sell the house because they bought it for 50. They put 25 in. They'll sell the house for 85. They'll make 10,000. They're not trying to make that, they're trying to do what we're doing. And the family that moves in will have $20,000 in equity the day they walk in the door.
Nice.
So that's a pretty sweet model also.
Will he sell it with owner financing or lease option, or how is he selling it?
Yeah, I think they are holding the note on some of those.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I love that too. In a lot of ways, it's a bigger win-win if you have a property and you're selling. If you can sell it on a long-term owner financing, right, with none of the shenanigans of subprime loans, that's a great way to sell properties. And instead of being the landlord, you could be the bank.
Yes.
But
that Joe is that was the original idea.
Yeah.
For the fam, and we want to build it to there, because that also makes the fam long-term sustainable, where we're not always coming out and asking for donations and grants and all that. Because if we hold the note on enough properties, even if we have very low interest rates, then there's a constant source of revenue for the fam
Yeah.
which then we can use to buy more houses.
Yeah. Well, that's cool. I think there's got to be somebody listening here to this podcast who can think of some good creative ways to help a ministry, an organization like this, even if it's not in St. Louis, it's maybe in your own market.
Yeah.
This is something that you guys should really look at. And we're coming up to an hour already. Wow. Crazy. But Brent, the main website is thefamstl.com. Is it okay if I give your church website out also?
Yeah, man, for sure.
All right. I already got it up here anyway. I was going to show it anyway. onefamilychurch.com. You got 2 locations, one in the Shaw neighborhood, one in the Delmar Loop.
So the Shaw campus, we physically reopen in 2 weeks, March 14th.
Wow. Okay.
So we are online. Everything is online now. Both campuses reopen on Easter Sunday, and then both campuses will be back in person starting Easter Sunday, going forward. We're what we call fully digital, which means we're fully physical, be in person, and fully digital. All our ministries are offered, both ways.
You were breaking up a little bit. It's a cool play on words, physical and digital. Digital? Digital. Okay.
Yeah, fully digital.
This is good, man. This is really good. Brent, we could talk a long time. I'm just looking at my notes here to make sure I don't have any other. Oh, one thing too that was really good. You talked about like being willing to embrace imperfect solutions.
Yeah.
Talk about that real quick, because I thought that was good. And then you talked about what are the consequences of not taking care of this problem. Remember that we were talking about that?
Yeah. So I think one of the things that people get nervous about is they go, well, like, what can I do, right? And when you start to try to figure out what to do, a lot of times we go, well, that's not a perfect solution.
Yeah.
My mind is like, okay, there is no perfect solution. The perfect solution would be to undo the oppression and discrimination of the past and start over and not do all of that. Okay, we can't do that. It's wildly imperfect, though, to say can't do anything. Screw it. Good luck. Hope it works out. Right? If there's an injustice, it's kind of like this. I got 4 kids. If one of my children, if I find out that my oldest son was stealing $1 from my youngest son every day for a month, at the end of the month, I go, son, what are you doing? Stop stealing your brother's money. And he goes, okay, I'm going to stop stealing my brother's money. And I go, well, where's the money? I want you to give it back. And he goes, well, I spent it. Right? That means we have an imperfect, so we got to come up with an imperfect solution. But it wouldn't be appropriate for me to just say, okay, well, if you already spent it, then there's nothing you can do. Right? I've got to come up with a way to address the injustice that was done to my youngest son by my oldest son. Right? So it's the same with this. We can't not do something just because it's not perfect. There is no perfect.
And just because I didn't cause the problem.
Right. Also, yeah.
That's not an excuse. Excuse me. That's not an excuse to say there's nothing I can do about it.
Right. Right.
I mean, you certainly can if you want, right? But if you want to be, let's just talk about God here a little bit. If you want God's blessing in your life, then you need to be a little more charitable. You need to have a little bit more compassion. Yeah. And you need to be a little more generous. Maybe your time, your resources, your treasures, your talents, and all of that stuff. And I think that this is so important for people to hear. Yeah. If we want God's blessing as a nation, as a city, this is something that we can't ignore. Right. This is something we cannot ignore. And if we want God's blessing, this is, I think, the only way that we can do it. And it's because
verse, Isaiah 58.
Yeah.
Isaiah 58, God says, what kind of, it's fasting. Like we're in Lent right now, for a lot of people. What kind of fasting do you want? What kind of fasting pleases me, God says. And he goes, take care of the oppressed, lift the hand of oppression off of people, free people, lean in, help people, serve people, take care of people. And then the light will break through on you. Your fountains will be full. I mean, it's like this picture of like what we become when we're willing to love each other and care for each other and look after each other. Not because like, I'm guilty, I'm ashamed, I did it, none of that. It's because when we see something that is not right, that is not the way God would have wanted it to go. And we have the power to do something about it. It brings as much benefit to us as to the person we're serving. I mean, my life expands.
That is so good what you just said.
Yeah, man. My life expands when I pour out for somebody else. My life, it creates room for my life to be filled up more. And so I just
get more blessing out of doing the giving and giving the compassion. Yeah. You actually get more blessing out of it than you're actually giving to the other person.
That's right. They benefit, you benefit as much, if not more.
Yeah.
You know, it's more blessed to give than to receive. I mean, that's the scripture, right? It just is.
Yeah.
It just is.
One of my favorite books of all time is Robert Morris's book, The Blessed Life.
Yeah.
And I love that book.
Yeah.
And it's exciting. You get to give. So anyway, appreciate you being on my podcast, Brent. thefamstl.com, thefamstl.com. Go check it out, guys. There's some information about things, ways that you can help, even donate some money if you want. But I think more than that, it's just like how getting educated.
Yeah.
And recognizing that this problem does exist and we can't just ignore it. We need to have some compassion.
Yeah.
And I think that's so critical. Thefamstl.com and your church website. And you have a lot of online sermons as well.
Yeah.
People can go see your videos
at
onefamilychurch.com.
Yep. Yeah. Awesome.
Very cool. Thank you, Brent.
Hey, thank you, man. This has been like a joy for me. And I'm gonna start listening to your podcast, getting educated on real estate, brother. This is awesome.
Well, good. I thank you very much. Maybe we should play some golf sometime.
I'm down for that. I'm a terrible golfer, so we can play best ball, but I like it. I'm just bad at it.
Do you like golf? Do you have clubs?
I don't have clubs. I'm left-handed. My wife just gave my clubs away, but I'll rent some.
We better ask your wife if you can play.
She said these are collecting cobwebs. You don't use these. And so she gave them away to the good one. So
all right, sounds good. Thanks, Brent. We'll see you guys later.
Thanks,
Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.